In this video, I want to give you feedback about your responses from quiz 1 and give you a general idea of how you're doing as a class. So the bad news is 14 out of 26 completed the quiz on time. The good news is 21 students have submitted at least 2 assignments. The next 2 big things that you have are the postmodern sovereignty draft, where you're going to tell me about what you think about these concepts, and then the midterm exam. So this is also kind of a way of starting to prepare for both of those and to try to think about maybe doing things a little bit differently than what you might be used to in other classes. So these are your answers. And remember, the question here was, how do judges judge? Not what do judges judge? So how, right? The best answers I'm looking for would fall into 2 categories. One would be a structural category, like the answer you see here in the orange box. Even though this particular student was unsure of their answer, this is a good structural answer. By structure, we mean the system outside of the judicial system. So this helps us understand that courts are not separate from the rest of society. And so if you see that there's social inequality, you see racism in society, you should expect that to also occur within the courts. This will hurt a lot of people's preconceived notions before they take a class like this, because you were likely told by someone, probably an educator at some point, that you can fight for your rights in court or you can get your day in court. Unfortunately, the more you study the court system, you'll find that that is rare. And even in cases in which people do quote unquote win, the consequences or the remedy is never as good as the harm was bad. And so that's a good systemic argument, seeing that the court is already biased, and many of you kind of talked about that a bit. The other thing I'm looking for, though, is the one here that's in italics. And I like this phrase, help from a different case, because sometimes students think that judges quote different cases, and they certainly use quotes from different cases, but these are just guidance. So it's not an automatic thing, as I'm going to try to get into more in a second. But I want to contrast this. So that's a good answer, because you're talking about how, right? What is the judge actually doing? Some of the answers were very vague, and they tended to repeat the conclusion, or they seemed to be something that I could copy and paste off of Wikipedia. So I'm not asking what did the court decide. That's not the question. It's how do judges judge? How do judges make decisions? How? What is the process that they go through? I'll put it this way. Unless you're a very fun, unique, special individual, when you think about what kind of ice cream you want, I bet you don't go through the same process of having to go through 3 years and a couple $100,000 worth of tuition to go to law school. So judges are unique. They don't go through cases as if they're picking out their favorite ice cream. So there's going to be a thinking process that's very different that judges do than almost any other field. Education and especially legal scholarship is similar because we're looking at judges. But there are other fields that make a similar choices. Biologists tend to go through this process, some chemists. And we're going to get into that a little bit deeper in this presentation, but you have to try to get away from using vague language. So interpret the laws. Well, every human does interpretation in every single thing that they ever read. And so is it true that judges do this? Yes. But did you make that clear to me, what you mean by the word interpret and what you mean by the laws and what that reasoning is? No. Same thing with apply the law or using international law. Personal views is very unlikely. In other words, judges don't generally have personal views about these subjects. Why would they? So, for example, Judge Downing didn't have any personal views on whether same-sex couples should be able to be given a marriage license, because it's not his job, right? That's something, if I worked at the marriage license place, I'd think about that issue. But if I'm not supposed to be really doing this, I don't walk down to the marriage license place and start handing out marriage license. Why would I sit around thinking about these things? So you could probably make a list of 10 things you really care about, and then you could look at the newspaper or look at social media, and you could find 100 things that you don't care about. And so if I asked you what your personal views were on those things, now you might be able to come up with something like your favorite ice cream, but if these are complicated issues, your personal views really aren't going to have much to do with it. This is different than biases and processes, right? The personal bias, like if I'm a man, which I am, right, and my case is about the female reproductive system, I don't know very much about that. So I'm going to make a case that's based on my biases of what I do know. And I'm not really going to, have much knowledge on those other subjects. And so, personal bias is there, but it's pretty limited, largely because of the appeals process and because of the body of law that one has to work with. Also not quite, correct. These are like B answers, B minus, maybe a C plus if I'm, really trying to look at your analysis. Same thing with like evidence, or they take the information they're given. This is what we all do, right? So when you get into your car and you look at the evidence of whether you have enough gas, you then make a decision. So you have to show me more than that, right? There's more to it than that. You might get in your car, look at the gas gauge and say, well, I don't have enough money. So now I'm not going to go to this place that I was going to go. I'm going to go to somewhere closer, right? And so that's now you're telling me what's the decision process that you're going through. Judges do the same thing, just on a much more complicated level. So this is also kind of related to what have you learned so far? What you should have learned by this point is you should have learned the legal language and start to use that legal language that the judges use in Anderson and Lawrence. You should have more knowledge about the 14th Amendment because both those cases were about the 14th Amendment. You should have a much more grounded view of rights. You should be able to describe accurately some of the actors in the court system. You should be able to discuss the levels, including appeals, federal, state, local court. And you should really have some knowledge about the adversarial process and what that means and what that does not mean. And you should also think about collegiality and how that applies. These were all part of the week 1 and 2 reading. You should have started to brainstorm about sovereignty, and you should have done some independent research to start to see what does that word mean so that it becomes so clear to you why that's an important term in the legal system. You should have learned about conflict resolution and the limits of what the court system is really able to do. It's not going to solve most of the problems in society or in your personal life for that matter. And you should have been able to start to think about the fact that norms change over time by thinking about the Miller case and the Two Live Crew case. That some of you probably heard about both of those and said, well, this is crazy. Yes, but that's what people will say about the decisions that are being made now 40 years from now, right? So you see this kind of, it's not really a back and forth, it's that people tend to romanticize history or the future, but we really haven't changed much as far as who has power and how these rules work out in the court system. And so really I'm trying to get you to see what legal reasoning is and how it's different than other things. I liked some of these answers. A lot of you started thinking about overstepping power as abuse, and that's really probably the thing I really want you to get to see in the Miller and the Two Live Crew cases, that you saw the legislature definitely overstep their power, and the courts tried to check them on that in one case, and they failed to check them on it in another case. Many of you, however, this is the bad side, you started seeing law as a command in general and punishment in general, almost like it was an automatic magic thing. And you've switched to now thinking that judges do this. I understand this mistake. If you were seeing it as this thing that just kind of is magical and mystical and changes people's behavior, and then you saw that that doesn't work, then your instinct would probably be, well, let's put it inside of a person, and we'll give them the power. But again, that's not really what comes out in the cases. Judge Downing explains very clearly, you might want to reread that case, that he doesn't feel comfortable giving commands in that case. He's really trying to struggle to find out what he should do. Same thing in Texas versus Lawrence. The court really struggles to figure out what should be the appropriate response. And you should also see that in Texas and in California, they had given commands. They had tried to go through punishments. And the court said, whoa, 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 this isn't quite such a good idea. And so that's not really working as being a judge, being a commander and a punisher, as much as now the judges are trying to figure out, they're in the middle of this madness. So I like this phrase and the pun, the limits are not that limited. And that's a good point on, this is really a complicated idea, but that there's two ideas here. On the one hand, that whatever limits that you read about in a textbook, checks and balances, all those pretty phrases that don't really mean much when you start looking at the real world, there's not too much of a limitation, because you can see that people kind of do whatever they want, and we're only looking at, because it's the legal system, we're looking at legal cases. So these are just the cases that got into the court. Think about all the people who have been prosecuted on obscenity laws and very similar kind of processes, or sodomy laws that weren't famous, that didn't have money to defend themselves in court and went to jail for it. And so in that sense, the limits of power are pretty unlimited. On the other hand, the limits are limited in the sense that there is only so much one can do within a courtroom, right? And so that's really what I was looking at, is that judges are actually pretty limited as human beings, that they're not going to be able to solve every problem. They're not going to be the commander and the punisher. I'm glad to see one student talked about the appeals process. I'm hoping that most of you start to really investigate that, because that will complicate your ideas of what you think law and laws are. And we'll focus a lot on that in the second half of the semester. I liked that, seeing that a law can limit privacy. In fact, lots of laws limit privacy, even though we're told that we have a right to privacy. And yet our privacy is constantly invaded or limited, depending on how you want to look at it. And for sometimes good reasons, meaning that the reasons given are logical and they seem to make sense, and some people seem to agree with them. And then in other cases, for no reasons at all. Absolutely nothing, since we found out that the government was spying on us. Now we've just found out that more governments are spying on us. The Israeli government is spying on us through our cell phones and whatnot. You might as well assume everybody's spying on us at this point. And so nothing has, interfered with those people to break into our computers and look and see what we're doing. And so, on the one hand, laws can make it so that it makes it easier for people to violate privacy. And then in other situations, there is no law to stop people from violating our privacy. Very important point that a student pointed out is that legal decisions change depending on the times and places. And that's really a key thing that you need to learn in this class, is that there's not a universal law. And then this is a good way to think about it, is that it all depends on how people look at it. Which side of the world are you looking at? And try to keep in mind that you're not a judge, right? And so the judges are looking at it from a very restrained point of view. And this is kind of the main point. Judges are way outside of the mainstream. So they're not everyday people. They're not ordinary folks. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be. I mean, at one time they were, and the expectation was that they would be. But when I listen to judges talk and when I talk to them, they admit this often, is that they don't really know what's going on in the hearts and minds of the everyday person. Many of them picked being a judge and being a lawyer because they like being in quiet places like libraries and reading and writing. So they're not really going to know with what's going on the street or at protests, or I'm not saying every single judge, but very few of them are going to be actively engaged in political struggles, and most of them are not allowed to engage in those kind of struggles because of the Constitution restrictions on political activities. And so judges really don't settle the social norms of the day. I know every once in a while you get a textbook or a talking head on the media or a social media post that says that judges do this, but in reality, judges don't do this, and judges don't ever say they do this. And I don't know a single judge who would ever want this job to try to solve all the social problems in the world. The other issue is, as we said in the previous slide, is that norms change. I mean, for those of you who said, Miller violated the law, Mapplethorpe violated the law, Two Life Crew violated the law, and what they did was obscene. Well, that means that Kardashian, South Park, right? There'd be so many celebrities that would be in jail right now if this test was actually applied to everyone. So again, it's not fairly applied. This law is, used politically for people who want to target certain behaviors that they don't like, and that's obviously not due process. And so you got to think about this. Like, why aren't there more crimes under the obscenity laws? It's still law. So why don't people use this more often? Well, it's a tricky answer, right? Because if you were to go to small towns across the country, I guarantee this law is still applied. But it's not going to be something you're going to see a lot in the media. And I think you can come to your own conclusions why what Kim Kardashian has done under the law would be seen as obscene, but why she has not gone to jail for that or even been arrested. Judges also, I like this quote: individual identities are redefined either as a result of changing societal groups or as a result of changing interpersonal behavior. I would probably only I'd correct one mistake in that sentence, is that it's not or, it's and. We all are part of a societal group, so you can't change your interpersonal behavior without changing how you think about the group you're in. But judges are in a very particular group. They're with other judges, and they're within lawyers, and lawyers have the rules of professional conduct, and those are very different than the general laws and the general behaviors that, say, people in most workplaces have. And so, their identities are going to be redefined based on how they see themselves within that group, and then how they see themselves with other groups, right? Their churches or other religious institutions. Like, if depending on how they see that role, do they think church and state should be separate, or do they think that there should be some overlap? So it's a complicated identity that you're going to get for legal actors. They're not going to be very easy to categorize. And then I just want to draw attention to the picture, right? What was true of what people said was the social norm of the 1950s, well, that only applied to a very small group of people. And so oftentimes, if you see what the media is calling social norms, that represents the interests of the people watching that channel or on that Instagram page, not on society at large. Not all 300 plus million people have been asked what are their social norms. So in review, rights are not about establishing moral truths. That's not what courts do. So get that out of your head immediately. They're also not about the ideals of deliberative democracy that you might have read in your American government textbooks or heard about in high school. That's not what courts do. It's a very nice idea, but it's just not realistic. They, on the average, most common, Judge Judy and those kind of shows, those are shows. That's entertainment. Those are not judges. Those are not cases. Those are mediation. But they are accurate in the sense that those are the kind of petty disputes that are most common among common folks. And other petty disputes, whether somebody's fence is on the wrong side of a property line, whether you should get a parking ticket or not. These are all the things that courts this is the majority of the time, not on serial murders, not on rape cases, not on huge corporate espionage. These are great movies, right? But this is not reality. Reality is the cases are really boring. For every case that Judge Downing had, that was a super important one that made it into the newspapers, he had 500 that you wouldn't really care about. The other issue is that, rules, norms, rights are not universal. So they're not used equally for and against all people, and not all people agree. And so you got to get out of that habit. I know that is often in a textbook, so you got to get rid of that knowledge. It was useful to pass that class, but it's not useful moving forward. And it will never apply to any kind of paper that you have to write or any analysis. So you just kind of leave that with that early thinking, and then now you're in an advanced class, and you're going to think differently now. There should be no more generalizing, summarizing the conclusion. That's not what this class is. So in some classes, you read something, you copy and paste from that, and then the teacher gives you an A. That's not this class. So please, 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 moving forward, no more summarizing the readings. Don't give me generalized statements. Don't copy and paste the conclusions from Wikipedia. You have to show me critical thought to pass this class. which means you have to give me the reasons that the court makes its decision, that judges make the decision, and your reasons for choosing those reasons. So you should get in the habit of making this phrase on the one hand. On the other hand, one student said on the other side of the coin. This is how you have to start talking, is that there's never going to be one thing. There's going to be 2, 3, 5, 10, 100 different things. You're going to have to make choices about which of those things you think are important. And if you make legal reasoning choices, then you'll do better. And so rules are not like theories. I'm going to say that again. Judicial rules are not like theories. Judicial rules are not proved to be good. They're not peer-reviewed. They're not tested out in a laboratory. They're handed down from judge to judge to judge to judge. So let me give you a really bad rule that is still good law. Those of African descent are not considered citizens of the United States. That case, Scott versus Sanford, was never overruled. Bad rule, terrible rule, evil, racist rule. The 14th Amendment didn't overrule that. It went around it, and it said, well, if you were born here, then you get to be a citizen. So it's not saying you're not a citizen. It's saying you have to be a citizen this way. Well, that has only really been true of people within the last 100 years. So there was about 50 years after that 14th Amendment was passed where people just didn't follow this rule. And people didn't treat people equally for the reasons, and would quote racist language like in Scott versus Sanford up through the 1950s. And you could even look at the police cases today or the uneven prison population, and you could see that the reasoning from Scott versus Sanford is still evident in the legal system, just because that rule was passed down, and it's never been overruled. As you can see, in the 60s, Roe versus Wade was a judicial rule, and lots of people disagree with it. It'll be interesting to see what the courts do. But these aren't based, again, on science. These aren't experiments. These are not researched. Right? These are things that judges have done over and over and over again. Doesn't mean they don't have logical reasoning. It just means that they're not like theories. So they're not like other classes, in other words. You have to think differently. So the way judges think is more like how scientists, biologists think in applying evolution. They accept the rule. Then they look at the case. Then they apply the rule to the case, and they get the outcome. Or a haiku. You accept the rule of poetry in making a haiku. You don't fight it. You don't challenge it. You don't argue with it. You accept it. And then you apply some words. You try to put it in haiku form, and then you look at it, maybe give it to somebody who says, that's a haiku. That's how lawyers think. That's how judges think. So they aren't really trying to undermine. You see people in the media say, Roe v. Wade should be overturned. This is not what lawyers and judges do. They don't think like that. They don't think overturn. They think I can get a good argument, legal argument, to adjust or change the judicial rule. But they're not going to overturn anything. So you need to start thinking A plus B equals C, where you're going to have to choose what is A, what is B. You will not choose what is C. So there'll be more than one judicial rule. So you have to choose. That's your A. You have to choose the judicial rule you think makes the most sense in that situation. Then you have to find the judicial facts as opposed to the facts. And I'll give you a hint. Case briefs and Wikipedia are not going to help you with this. Students who try that route always end up failing. You're going to have to do this yourself, because I'm going to give you patterns that are not on the internet, and suddenly you won't know what to do. And this is not about debating, and it's not about opinions, and that's why you have to start thinking like a judge in order to be able to analyze what judges do. So this type of reasoning is called abductive reasoning, or the logical model it uses is called abductive reasoning. This is different than deductive and inductive reasoning. And so it's going to be new for you. It's like learning a new language. You use deduction a lot. It was a skill they taught you in high school. They use it in philosophy classes, politics classes, anywhere you're doing kind of general analysis. And you're accepting theories and definitions. You'll say something Karl Marx said. You'll say Emile Durkheim said. Or you'll say Michel Alexander said. and then you make an argument based on that. That's not what we're doing here. We're not deducing from those facts. Induction is a tool you'll use in sociology, psychology, technology classes, business class. You'll collect a bunch of stuff, right? You'll do your data, you'll collect it, and then you'll look at it, and then you'll come up to some outcome based on that collection and aggregation. That's not what lawyers do. It's not what judges do. So I want to just say, none of these are good or bad, right? I mean, these are all the way that these different disciplines and ways of thinking think. But it would be bad or wrong for you to use deductive and inductive reasoning to analyze judicial reasoning, right? You have to use judicial reasoning to analyze judicial reasoning. So again, just to repeat, judges use rules that have been written down by their judges. And so you have to look at the largest number of the cases that use those rules, and then look at those reasons. And that's the most important thing. It's not enough to say, well, there's 6 cases that said that sodomy should be protected by the 14th Amendment. You have to give the reasons. So some of those reasons were certainly based on international law, but that wasn't the only basis. They used lots of different reasoning. Judicial cases then are legal facts, not facts, but legal facts. And these are the ones that both sides, the adversarial system, have agreed are the ones that they say stipulated to. It means that they agreed to in the court proceeding. And so those are the things that you tend to copy and paste onto the internet. That is not what you need to do here. You need to take those facts and then apply them to the cases. And how did that work? Is this case more like Lawrence versus Texas? Is it more like Miller versus California? Or is it more like Anderson County? And then the judicial conclusion will be the reasoning as you apply it, right? That's not the conclusion or what happened in the case. That's what's the logical reasoning. What's the result of A and B? That's really what you have to start doing. And if you're able to do that, then you'll do really well in this class, and I'll continue to help you, and you'll get lots of practice doing it. But this is what you need to start thinking about for the midterm in particular.